Hello and welcome to Decision NYC with Ben Max. I'm Ben Max, your host and the executive editor of Gotham Gazette. The 2021 New York City election cycle is well underway and it's poised to be the most significant municipal election in decades. All of city government is on the ballot, and because so few incumbents are eligible to run for their current seats due to term limits, New Yorkers are electing many new office holders and the next roster of leadership for our city. There will be a new mayor of New York City elected here in 2021, as well as a new city comptroller, several new borough presidents, and many new city council members. That's not all that's on the ballot. A number of incumbents are eligible for and seeking re-election, including the city's public advocate, and there's a very crowded and competitive race for Manhattan District Attorney, and still more. Party primaries are set for June, and the general election in the fall will culminate on November 2nd. This is the first full set of municipal elections that will feature both early voting and the new ranked choice voting system. Now, ranked choice voting only applies to party primaries and special elections for city government positions. We'll have a separate show explaining ranked choice voting. This city election cycle would be of enormous importance under more usual circumstances, but it's unfolding at a time of great crisis for our city, raising the stakes of the decisions that you, the voter, will make. The next wave of city leadership will quite clearly make or break the city's recovery from the devastation of the COVID-19 pandemic and its many impacts on health, families, jobs, housing, education, and much more. It's also important to note, of course, that the city faced a number of crises even before COVID hit, and several of those have only worsened. So it's an important time of choosing here in New York City, and we're pleased to bring you this series of interviews with candidates running for citywide offices, mayor, comptroller, public advocate, as well as borough-wide positions like borough president and Manhattan district attorney. And there will be debates for city council seats as well. But these one-on-one conversations will help you get to know the candidates better, learn about their backgrounds, their platforms, their vision for the future of the city and the office they're hoping to seek. We hope this interview and others are helpful to you as you sort through your many choices and make informed decisions when it's time to vote. So today we're focused on the position of New York City Comptroller. The Comptroller is a citywide elected position considered the city's independently elected chief fiscal officer and budget watchdog. The Comptroller evaluates many city contracts with outside entities, audits city agencies to find waste and inefficiency, makes recommendations and proposals to improve city government, as well as other services and entities impacting New Yorkers, and crucially, the comptroller is a fiduciary to the city's 5 public pension funds that total assets of about $240 billion and are key to many city retirees and current city employees, as well as future city employees. So that's a sketch of the job, but there's much more to it than even that. And we're pleased to be joined for this interview by Zoom by Terri Liftin, a Democratic candidate for New York City Comptroller. Terri, thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much, Ben, for having me.
So you're running for New York City Comptroller, and we'll get to your platform for that race and for your vision for the future of that office if you are successful. But a little bit about your background first. Who are you? Where do you come from? What are the highlights of your resume before this race?
Okay, well, I'm a mom of 2 boys, a 12-year-old and an 18-year-old. I've been married to my husband for 22 years, and I've lived in Manhattan since 1986. I was raised on Long Island, right on the Queens-Nassau County border. Both my parents were professors. My mom was a professor of science at Queensborough, and my dad at Columbia Medical School. They were the first generation in their families to go to college, and now they're retired, living off of their pensions. So in 1986, I came to Manhattan to attend Barnard College. I graduated in 1990. I have a master's degree in economics from NYU, and I attended Brooklyn Law School on a merit scholarship. My professional experience includes a year working at the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey as an economic analyst, and I was actually working in the Twin Towers the first time the attempt was made to take them down. After law school, I worked in 2 large law firms, the first in a litigation department, and it was there that I learned the anatomy of a legal case, when to settle and when to fight. And then at the second firm, I learned the securities laws. And for the last 15 years, I've worked in the asset management business as the chief legal and chief compliance officer. The firms where I worked manage pension fund money, private pensions, state pension, city, and union Taft-Hartley. I know what it means to be a fiduciary to a pension plan, and I have reviewed and negotiated billions of dollars of investments on behalf of pension plans. As the chief counsel, I've reviewed thousands of third-party contracts, and I've negotiated legal actions. And when I was wearing my hat as chief compliance officer, I've put in place countless forensic monitoring programs to make sure we followed the money and expenses were proper under our documentation. So the reason why I always emphasize my training is because it's so important that, as you said, the city's next chief fiscal officer, next financial officer is competent and can do the job on day one.
Okay, thank you. That's a great background. So let's talk about, since you have this experience related to asset management, pension funds, let's start there. How would you approach that part of the job as controller? What needs to be done differently? There's been conversation in past elections about trying to combine the 5 pension funds. Those are obviously very complicated decisions. And unlike the state controller, the city controller has significantly less influence in terms of the pension asset management. So how would you approach that part of the job? Are there big structural reforms you try to make? Are there ways you try to help manage the assets? What would you do there?
Well, the first thing I would do is reorient the pension plans to focus on performance. I mean, going back to 2014, the New York Times was reporting that the overlay of political judgments onto the pension funds was really harming performance. And, my view is we can invest in climate change, we can invest in affordable housing, but the first decision has to be made on the underwriting of a particular investment. We have to meet the obligations that we owe to our retirees, and if we don't, it means that taxpayer funds are used to plug the unfunded gap. And that's a problem, particularly when we're struggling to find a balanced budget. Recently the hurdle rate, which is the expected rate of return of the pensions, was reduced 8 to 7 to 4%. And to me, that means that this gap just widened, the gap between what we owe and what we have. And I think it's very important. So 1, let's focus on performance, and 2, let's focus on honest and transparent accounting. Everyone should be able to understand the numbers. Let's make sure we understand exactly what that gap is.
So how is it not happening right now that performance is the main focus? I heard you mention a couple examples where the current city controller, Scott Stringer, and others have pushed for divestment from fossil fuel companies, for example. There are candidates in the race talking about using more pension fund assets for investment in affordable housing. Is the direction that things have been headed wrong? Is that talk misguided? What exactly is off about what's happening right now, and how would you shift it?
Well, yes, I think the discussion is off. I don't believe we need a strategic plan to rethink the asset allocation. We have expert investment professionals advising our pensions. The asset allocation is in line with what most economists believe on Wall Street. But the fact is, Ben, that the S&P was up 18% every year for the last 12 years, 600%. The pensions didn't even get close to that. So the question is, well, why not? Why aren't we investing based on return? Well, we're investing based on political ideals. I mean, to me, affordable housing by design shouldn't be profitable. I understand there's a desire and there is a bucket for economically targeted investments, which is 2%, and that would be $5 billion. But for me, every single investment should be focused on underwriting and performance, and we should really push the consultants who control the pipeline of managers. We should reduce their costs. We should encourage them to look at a broader array of managers, and then we should use the $240 billion to negotiate costs. Other pension funds do this. I mean, I negotiate with pension funds, or I used to negotiate with pension funds all the time. They really push hard for reduced management fees and other types of benefits. But we can do that. So on the revenue side, focus on performance. On the cost side, push managers to charge us less.
Isn't part of the reason that the pension funds haven't matched the S&P is because the assets, need to be invested with much more of sort of the long-term approach and a little bit more carefully than sort of the year in, year out risks of the market?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there has to be, 30% in fixed income, and we all know rates have been, fairly low. So I'm not saying that the pension fund should be at 18% return. It has to be a carefully compiled portfolio, which it is. But if you look on the website, if you look at the managers, if you look at the performance, it's clear that some strategies are performing better than others. And, I really believe that we should be focused on, I keep saying this, on performance, and we should first and foremost. And then once we select our managers, then we can force them or encourage them to invest responsibly.
How does long-term thinking come into play there? Because one of the arguments for divesting from fossil fuel companies is that, they're not thinking far enough ahead, that, they're not good investments in the longer term. Now, there's obviously arguments against that as well, that these companies are adapting because they're big global companies and they're not stupid. They see the green energy future. But where does sort of longer term estimates about where the global economy is heading come into play there in terms of assessing long-term risk?
Well, if the decision to divest is made based on a global an economic consensus about the economy going forward, then I applaud that decision. If the decision to divest is made to punish energy companies for investing in fossil fuels, then I have to say I disagree with that decision. I think the Europeans are far ahead of us in staying invested in energy companies and forcing those companies to change within, because those companies have the infrastructure and the know-how to move forward on clean energy.
I was just gonna ask you about sort of that philosophy, because for most of the time over the last few years, that's sort of been State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli's philosophy was you can be an activist investor without divesting, right? And that your best opportunity to actually influence these companies is to remain invested, but to influence them. Is that your philosophy? Do you not really have a sort of really an agenda about sort of politics or philosophy or activism, and it's really just the sort of cold hard number calculation?
No, I have a heart too, and so I agree with Tom's approach. You stay invested, and then you work within the system to force change. I mean, and I'm not an expert, Ben, but from what I've read, some of the larger energy companies, particularly in Europe, have already moved, their investment, 30% into wind. So to me, that's really great news.
All right, so let's and anything else you want to mention on pension fund management or structural approach? Anything else before we move on?
No, just that I believe that the boards and the investment professionals are really, really top notch, and I'd like to see more responsibility taken in-house in the controller's office to screen and select managers. I think generally, having gone through the consultant process, I think consultants are useful, but they cost a lot of money and they're risk adverse. So it would be really wonderful if we can broaden out the scope of the managers that we consider. And I do believe we should be considering more minority and women-owned managers. And we don't have to start with writing a check to $100 million to a smaller manager, because I know pensions are adverse to first-time managers if they're raising their first institutional fund. But there's a way to bring a broader array of management-led firms, minority and women-led firms into the process with great results. Other pension funds are doing that.
And to bridge the pension funds with other aspects of the role of controller and things we need to discuss here, how concerned are you? How concerned should New Yorkers be about the outstanding pension liabilities that the city has and the ability to meet those? How concerned are you about the city's outstanding other debt that comes through the capital program? Sort of structurally on fiscal footing on those two big buckets, how do you assess the sort of risk and the standing of New York City at this point?
Well, Ben, I'm very concerned about the gap in what's underfunded in our pension system, and I'm particularly worried because I don't think anybody is telling us exactly what it is. And by lowering the hurdle rate from 7 to 4%, we just doubled the underfunded amount. I mean, if our actuarials thought that we were going to make 7, 8% over the next 20, 30 years on the pension fund investments, and now we're saying we're only going to make 4, how are we going to make up that difference? What do we currently owe to our existing retirees? What are we going to owe in the future? And somebody needs to tell us what that gap is and how we're going to plug it. I mean, one of the proposals in the budget was to sell down existing assets and use the profit on those investments to help fund the obligations. I mean, that's a terrible idea. It means that there are fewer assets to invest to generate return. So my priority is, first and foremost, honest and transparent accounting. We should be able to have a conversation where we know what the facts are and what the problems are and the proposed solution. And I don't think we're there yet. And then if you're talking about, generally, the city's debt, $125 billion, debt financing is an important tool that the city has to fund capital projects, and every city has it. But $125 billion is quite a debt load. I mean, right now, debt service costs the city $7 billion a year, and I think it's projected to increase to something around 11. It's 11% of tax revenue. Per capita, it's twice as much as most other cities. I mean, thankfully, the credit rating of the city and some of the entities that float the bonds, is still high, but that's going to be an important factor to look at over the coming year because it depends on our economy, the diversity of our business and our population going forward. And, I would say, let's try not to take on more debt. And then just to loop it back to another role of a controller is the audit power. So there are about 25 different agencies out there that have existing capital projects using debt-financed money. So we shouldn't be easier on the money that's spent that is borrowed. We should making sure that we audit. When we audit these agencies, we should take a look at how they're spending that money.
And I was going to the audit powers and responsibilities of the office next, so let's come back to that in just one second. But are you saying that the city really needs to reevaluate the capital spending and the amount of debt that it's issuing?
I'm saying I would.
Yeah. Okay. So on the audit responsibilities, the city controller has to audit at least one aspect of every city agency every 4 years. How would you approach that part of the job beyond what you just said about looking more closely at the capital spending? Are there agencies that you think are under-examined? Are there ways you would alter the way the office has approached that part of the job? How would you handle the audit function?
Well, first, what I would do is I would take a look at where the money has gone over the last 8 years, $25 billion. So let's understand who spent that money and on what. I would take a look at the last 5 years, 8 years worth of audit reports. Those audit reports provide a roadmap to each agency and the problems and the waste. So we need to be able to circle back. I mean, that's what regulators do. I mean, I've worked in a regulated business for the last 15 minutes. What the Securities and Exchange Commission does, The minute they come back in, the first thing they do is they go back to their initial report and they make sure that the advisor, the broker-dealer, the hedge fund covered off all of the problems. So let's start with past problems to make sure that we fix those. And then, as you said, let's look at the top agencies, the top contracts. Every time I go on the comptroller's website and there's a link to New York City checkbooks, and I look at the top 5 agencies, miscellaneous is among the top 5. I don't know what miscellaneous is, and I click through, and then there are more miscellaneous lines. I mean, how can that be? Billions of dollars on a miscellaneous line. So we should get to the bottom of that, and then we have to require accountability. And I know that's hard to kind of get your arms around, but if you look at the audit reports, who are they addressed to? The mayor, the speaker, and the council. So I'm not surprised that nothing gets done. We need to make sure that the agencies that are audited are also on that audit report, and then have someone in each agency that's responsible for following up on the deficiencies and coordinating with the comptroller's office.
Now, that gets at an interesting part of the job, especially, well, for all candidates, but especially those of you who haven't run for office before, haven't held office before, which is that there's also sort of, there's a political element to the job, right? You're in the political element of getting to the job right now, and then there's a political element if elected, where you have to decide, getting back to what you were just mentioning about how to try to make change. And there's the route you just described, which maybe is more of the ideal route, where the folks in the comptroller office are working with folks at the agencies and they're pushing them along and making reforms. But then it often takes, pushing the mayor publicly at a press conference, all sorts of other ways that are more on the political side of the equation. How would you approach that part of the job? How would you approach that relationship with the mayoral administration as another citywide elected official that is supposed to hold that mayoral administration to account?
I'm happy to say that, I am independent. So I don't have political alliances that I need to obey. And I'm also not interested in running for any other office. If anything's come through today, I hope it's that I'm qualified for this job and maybe not being mayor. So one, being independent. Two, all my life I've been a team player. I played team sports in high school. I played volleyball for Columbia for a year. And then I've worked in an industry where collaboration was crucial. And, I worked with front office, with back office folks. And the key is to make sure that we all agree on the same goal, which is to move New York City forward and to deliver services effectively and to spend money efficiently. And I think if we're all in this together and we're pulling in the right direction, there should be room to talk. I mean, I'm not a gotcha type person. I believe we need to get this done, and we all report back to the residents of New York City.
And in terms of agencies that need closer examination, the biggest buckets in the budget, you mentioned that miscellaneous does come up, and there needs to be some more accounting and transparency around a lot of city expenditures. But certainly the Department of Education is a huge part of the city budget, getting close to a third. There's the New York Police Department, there's homeless services, there's some of the bigger agencies and expenditures of the city. Do you think there's things that are sort of structurally wrong with how these agency budgets have grown over the years? Is there, because revenues allowed it, is there just significant bloat at this point? Are you concerned about the growth of those agencies in terms of their expenditures, or do you see the value in early childhood education expanding by so much that a lot of the growth was in expenses for additional teachers? How are you thinking about sort of those really big expenditures in the city budget at the agency level?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. It really is based in fact. I mean, is there a structural problem? Well, I would say that we can't afford over the next 8 years to hire an additional 30,000 people. But to the extent that in the past, a substantial portion of those 30,000 hires were teachers to fulfill the promise for universal pre-K, I think those were good hires. Um, in the end, it's all about finding the waste and the unnecessary positions. And you can audit, you can look at the agencies, you can look at overtime, and you can encourage each agency to be better managers. I mean, ultimately, employee job security should depend on being productive and having enough work to do, fully utilized. So one area would also be, look, if we have this huge, enormous resource of city employees, maybe we should look at third-party contracts, because I think going into the next 2 years, it's probably not a good time to look at laying off people. We really want our economy to grow, so let's do everything to avoid that. Cut down on overtime, bring unnecessary contracts in place, and then continue to reevaluate going forward.
I'm glad you brought up contracts because that's, again, where I was going next. Before we get back to contracting for a second, one of the structural issues in how the city spends its money that goes a little back to where we began is also that municipal employees have not been, it has not been part of the contracting to have them pay towards their healthcare premiums. Is that a structural problem in your mind? Is that something that should change? That's not the case at the state level. It's not the case in a lot of other places. This has come up in many political races over the years and other discussions. Do you think that's a structural issue that needs to be addressed?
Well, I mean, that's a very complicated, nuance, and at the same time, nuanced question. I mean, I can say from my own experience, as someone who spent years not contributing to my family's health care, I was the one who was working, who was providing the health care. And then under the Affordable Care Act, all of a sudden I looked at my paycheck and there was a deduction. And I went to the HR woman and I said, well, wait a minute, why are you taking out for health care? I never paid for health care before. And she said, well, we're required to do it now. But the result of that, Ben, was that I started thinking more about the cost of health care, the cost of doctors. And what I can say is that's really important. I mean, the closer we can bring consumers to the providers and an honest assessment of the cost of the service is better. So I'm not opposed to having employees contribute toward their health care. But I would want to understand a little bit more about what that means before I come out with a final decision.
All right. And on oversight of city contracting, you mentioned reevaluating how much the city is contracting when there might be structural issues at play. The city is facing some out-year budget deficits, although so much is fluid at this point based on federal aid and the rebounding of the economy, et cetera. But in terms of city contracting, is there anything else that needs to be changed in the either approval process or any other part of how the city does so many billions of dollars every year in outside contracting, other than sort of taking a closer look, as you mentioned?
$20 billion in third-party contracts, there's certainly a lot to work with there. I do believe that each agency should evaluate third-party contract. I mean, when I review a contract, one, I make sure that contracts don't just list services, but they're tied to results. And I believe that city contracts should be structured the same way. I think on an annual basis, at the time each contract is re-registered, I believe there's someone at each agency that needs to be accountable for making that decision. I mean, oftentimes the decision to re-register a contract is spread across a number of different agencies as well as the Comptroller's office. And therefore it's too diffuse to really make a decision on whether that contract should be renewed. And then once a contract is renewed, and I've heard this from a number of different, particularly nonprofits, it takes months for the approval process to get completed, and then payment is another 5 months. It seems to me that there are efficiencies to be gained not only in the process, but then also making sure that we're evaluating whether contracts have to be re-registered. And this is something that I've done in my job as well. It's not just a a problem in the city government. I mean, every year where I work, when I used to work, I would take a contract, whether it was for a Bloomberg terminal or a trade press, and I would ask the person responsible, hey, look, are we still using this? Do we still need this contract? Did we get what was promised? And do we need this going forward? And I think that's a really useful exercise, and that's something I would hope to carry out.
All right, well, we're going to leave it there. Terri Liftin is a Democratic candidate for New York City Comptroller. Thank you for taking the time.
Oh, thank you, Ben, very much. Have a great day.
And thank you for watching Decision NYC with Ben Max. Key decisions for New York City voters are coming up in the June primaries and the fall general election. I hope this conversation and others are helpful to you as you sort through your choices and make informed decisions when it's time to vote. I'm Ben Max. See you next time.